3 courtrooms, 1 small claims hearing in Texas, an intermediate court in Hangzhou, a procedural committee in Beverly Hills. None of them are venues that anyone watching Frontier AI Capital was paying attention to, but all 3 of them did something just recently that the trillion-dollar valuations are not pricing in. So let me start with the smallest one, because the smallest one is the most interesting. A guy in Travis County, Texas, named Ben Gawisser, paid Tesla $10,000 in 2021 for full self-driving. 5 years later, he still doesn't have it. Nobody does, really, not in the form that Tesla originally promised. So Gawisser did something that most of us would never think to do. He filed a small claims lawsuit, $73 on a filing fee, in an online portal with a video hearing, the kind of process designed for someone disputing a security deposit, not taking on a trillion-dollar automaker. And Tesla didn't even respond. They didn't show up. The court entered a default judgment for $10,672. So that included court costs and the original cost of the software. But now Tesla's trying to undo it. They filed for an extension 5 days after the response deadline, claiming they didn't get notice. But Gawisser's reply cited Elon Musk's own statement on the April 22nd earnings call. Musk acknowledged that FSD, as originally promised, cannot be delivered on the hardware that Gawisser bought. Now here's why this story is much bigger than just its dollar amount. The cost of replicating Gawisser's case is now far lower than the cost of the software that he was sold. $73 to file. A portal designed for non-lawyers, a published judgment, a video hearing, and there are potentially hundreds of thousands of other Tesla owners sitting on the same paid-for but undelivered software. But the thing I want you to see here is what just got built. Not by Congress, not by the SEC, not by a class action firm, but by one guy with $73 and an online portal. He created a working template, a path that any other FSD buyer can now walk down with the receipts they already have. Tesla declined to contest it on the merits. The judgment is now published, so the next person to file doesn't need a lawyer, they just need a printer. Watch for the first FSD small claims aggregator service in the next 2 quarters because the math is already there. That's one ruling. But now stay with me because the same week, but in a different country, in a completely different legal system, on a totally unrelated case, a court in Hangzhou did something structurally identical. A quality assurance supervisor in China named Joe. His company decided to replace him with a large language model and offered him a 40% pay cut as the alternative. Joe said no, and the company fired him. Joe sued, and he won at the lower court. The company appealed, and yesterday, the Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court upheld the lower court's ruling. The reasoning was specific. The dismissal didn't qualify as business downsizing. It didn't qualify as operational difficulty. It didn't meet the legal condition that made it impossible to continue Joe's contract. So firing him to install an AI system was not legal grounds for termination. A Zhejiang lawyer told the state news agency, quote, "Technological progress may be irreversible, but it cannot exist outside a legal framework." Now, China runs on civil law, not common law, so the Hangzhou ruling doesn't formally bind future cases, but Chinese intermediate court reasoning carries influence. Other intermediate courts do read it, they cite it, they build on it. This is published reasoning that will be sitting on judges' desks across the country the next time a Chinese tech worker gets the same offer that Joe got. And remember, 2 weeks ago, we were tracking stories of Chinese tech workers being told to train AI systems to replicate their own jobs. The ARC tracker on the Shared Sapiens website has the running record if you want to check it out. Yesterday's ruling is the judicial boundary on that exact pattern. Third one, Beverly Hills. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences released new Oscar eligibility rules. Performances must be, quoting here, demonstrably performed by humans with their consent. Screenplays must be human-authored. The Academy reserved the right to ask filmmakers about their AI usage. The rule arrives while an independent film is in production using an AI-generated version of the late Val Kilmer, while an AI actress called Tilly Norwood draws press attention, and while the Writers and Actors Guilds that went on strike in 2023 over precisely these questions watch how the institutional gatekeeping responds. So now, look at all 3 of these rulings together. A Texas small claims court, a Chinese intermediate court, a Hollywood awards body. None of them resolve whether AI can do underlying work. The Texas court didn't rule on whether FSD will eventually function. The Hangzhou court didn't rule that LLMs can't do quality assurance. The Academy didn't rule that AI-generated performances can't entertain audiences. What each ruling did was hold that within its specific jurisdiction, the substitution AI now enables cannot occur on existing terms, not until consent is documented, not until the contract is honored, not until the human is in the credits. And here's the broader signal, though. The legal architecture for AI governance is not being assembled where the capital is looking. The capital is watching Congress, treaty negotiations, federal rulemaking, Anthropic at $900 billion, Tesla converting Fremont to humanoid robots, $573 million in related party flows showing up in SEC filings. That's the layer that financial press knows how to read. The rulings yesterday came from a tier that the capital is not pricing against, a $73 filing fee, an intermediate court opinion, an awards body procedural rule. These are the venues where governance accumulates without legislative consensus, without treaty negotiation, without federal rulemaking. The frameworks are being written ruling by ruling, jurisdiction by jurisdiction in courtrooms whose procedural costs are low enough that the volume can build fast. A deeper look at all three rulings is in today's Century Report if you want the full thread. Now let's switch gears, because the same day those rulings came down, Tesla disclosed something in an amended SEC filing that I really want you to hear carefully. In 2025, Tesla took in $573 million in revenue from selling vehicles and megapacks to two other Musk-controlled entities. SpaceX bought $143 million in vehicles, XAI bought $430 million in megapack battery storage. The cross-company purchasing is continuing even into 2026, another $78 million from XAI to Tesla in the first 2 months of the year. Now, Tesla Energy did $12.77 billion in revenue last year, so the XAI purchases are only 3.4% of that or so. SpaceX's vehicle purchases are a smaller fraction of automotive sales. Neither share is structurally large enough to say that Tesla depends on related party flows. But what the disclosure does say is that the financial architecture connecting Musk-controlled entities is now substantial enough to register as material in SEC filings. The architecture is forming there. And here's the second piece. Tesla also announced its first large-scale Optimus humanoid robot factory will replace the Model S and Model X production lines in Fremont, designed for 1 million robots per year. A second line at Gigafactory Texas, designed for 10 million robots per year. Consumer sales planned for late 2027. So really feel what's being decided here. Tesla is dismantling the Model S line. The Model S, the vehicle that established the company to build a product whose end customer is not yet identifiable in the consumer market at the projected volume. So you might be thinking, this is just Musk being Musk, making big bets. That's his playbook. Fair. But notice what just happened structurally. 1 million unit per year humanoid robot factory under construction is itself a price signal. It pulls component supply chains, robotics talent, and competitor capital into a category whose demand curve does not yet exist. And in the same week, Meta acquired Assured Robot Intelligence to build robot-controlled foundation models. We just covered this. The bet is becoming consensus rather than singular. This is the inverse of how scarcity-era capital allocation worked. Demand used to be demonstrated before supply was built. The factory is the demonstration now. The capital gets committed at a scale that reshapes the market it depends on, and the demand discovery happens afterward. Whether the demand follows is genuinely an open question, but with the way robotics are going right now, as we've been covering, probably a pretty sure bet. And that bet is being expressed as physical factory floor, not just as a proposal. All right, let's shift away here. Saturday morning, before dawn, Spirit Airlines ran its last flight, NK-1833 from Detroit to Dallas-Fort Worth. It landed shortly after midnight. 17,000 direct and indirect employees lost their jobs. The airline that introduced cheap U.S. air travel and pioneered the unbundled fare model, gone after a 30-year run. Spirit had filed for bankruptcy twice in 18 months. The CEO cited the sustained rise in jet fuel prices. Fuel costs have roughly doubled in some markets since the US and Israel struck Iran back on February 28th. The fuel price spike was the exposure the second bankruptcy could not absorb. So I'm going to stay with this loss for a second because 17,000 jobs disappearing in the early hours of a Saturday is a real thing that happened to real people. Mortgages, kids in school, careers built around a business model that structurally collapsed in a single weekend. That displacement doesn't soften because there's a trajectory underneath it. But there is a trajectory underneath it. The same fuel price shock that ended Spirit is doing something else everywhere else. New Zealand plug-in vehicle sales rose 278% year over year in March, 26% market share with no government incentives, I emphasize. Australia hit 23% plug-in market share. BYD reportedly selling up to 800 vehicles per day in Queensland. Continental European EV demand was 51% higher than a year earlier. The UK's Optimus Energy recorded its biggest ever month for solar, heat pumps, and EV chargers in March. 5 US states are advancing legislation to overturn nuclear moratoriums. Let's repeat that number from New Zealand, 278% year over year, with no incentives. The market is reporting that the petroleum substitution is now cheaper than the petroleum it replaces. Household arithmetic flipping. The structural shape is that the same disruption that destroyed a discount airline business model is accelerating fossil fuel substitution across most of the rest of the world. Spirit couldn't survive the cost shock because its model depended on selling cheap seats on petroleum-burning aircraft. Households and businesses that can substitute electric transportation for gas transportation are doing it at accelerating rates because the cost calculus that justified that gas has flipped against it. Now, 17,000 jobs is a real loss, and the grid build accelerating across 3 continents in response to the same shock is what the loss is being absorbed into. Both things simultaneously. Okay, one more for today, and this one tells you where the substitution is actually landing on the ground. Just recently, in Lima, Ohio, a team of 12 engineers and construction workers spent a few days connecting 3,400 solar arrays to small floating docks across 4 acres of the Twin Lake Reservoir. The electricity will power a nearby water treatment plant where pumps run 24 hours a day. It's one of more than 25 floating solar installations underway from a Florida developer called D3 Energy. They've built more floating arrays in the US than any other company. Ohio gets more sun than Oregon, almost as much as Alabama, despite the gray reputation. The state ranks 12th nationally for solar capacity. First Solar's Perrysburg facility has spent $2.4 billion on perovskite semiconductor manufacturing and is now one of the largest solar module producers in the Western Hemisphere. But I want to pull out one detail from the Guardian piece that matters more than the headline numbers. A farmer in Paulding County named Doug Goyings has a 130 kilowatt array. The array eliminated his electricity generation bill, eliminated it, but the utility transmission and distribution charges have ballooned to nearly offset the savings. So stay with that detail here. Generation is no longer the binding constraint on distributed solar economics in Ohio. The rate structure of the wires connecting the generation to the load is. That is a regulatory layer, not a technological one, and it's the layer where the next decade of community energy economics gets decided. Meanwhile, tribal energy alternatives just awarded $3.2 million to 14 tribal nations for community-owned solar. Nearly 1.5 megawatts of capacity, trains 26 tribal members. Saves participating households roughly $3,300 per year. Silicon Ranch deployed its cattle tracker system in Tennessee, the first utility-scale solar designed to allow beef cattle grazing under moving panels. Cattle ranches becoming solar farms, reservoirs becoming generation assets, tribal lands becoming distributed energy infrastructure. Each one is a small story. Their cumulative effect is a generation system reorganizing around the assumption that petroleum-burning infrastructure has structural cost disadvantages that will not reverse. So here's what I want you to carry from today. The capital story this week is really loud. Anthropic raising $900 billion. Tesla dismantling the Model S line to build a million robot factory. $573 million in related party flows showing up in SEC filings. That's the story that made the financial press. The story underneath it ran through 3 courtrooms, a small claims hearing in Texas, an intermediate court in Hangzhou, a procedural committee in Beverly Hills. The capital architecture is being assembled on the assumption that capability will compound faster than the institutions designed to constrain it can mobilize. The rulings yesterday are evidence that a different layer of the institutional stack is mobilizing faster than the capital story assumes, not necessarily at the federal level, not at the treaty level, but at the $73 filing fee level, where rulings accumulate without requiring legislative consensus. And there's the trajectory underneath all of that. The Texas judgment converts every undelivered FSD buyer into a potential plaintiff with a working template. The Hangzhou reasoning will sit on judges' desks across China the next time a worker gets a 40% pay cut offer. The Academy rule is going to start appearing in guild contract language. Each one is a low-cost, high-volume template. The cost of reproducing them is collapsing toward zero, and that volume is the point. Meanwhile, the same fuel shock that ended Spirit Airlines is putting plug-in vehicles at 26% of the New Zealand market with no incentives. The same shock is reorganizing the reservoirs in Ohio into water treatment power. The same shock is putting cattle on solar farms in Tennessee. A 30-year-old airline business model collapsed because cheap fuel was a load-bearing assumption that stopped holding. The infrastructure replacing it doesn't have that assumption built in. What's being built in the cracks is a generation system that doesn't depend on cheap gas, and a governance layer that doesn't depend on legislative consensus. Both of them are forming on cadences the prior era's institutions weren't built to match. Both of them are forming through volume, not through breakthrough. Reservoir by reservoir, ranch by ranch, filing by filing, ruling by ruling. The factory in Fremont, loud. The reservoir in Lima is quieter, and so is the small claims court in Travis County. And the quieter ones are building the substrate that the louder ones will eventually have to operate inside. We'll see you tomorrow.